I spent the first part of the evening figuring out which keys went to which locks. The lot had 60 units arranged around a gravel aisle, with a small cinder block office near the gate and a row of numbers painted above the doors. Most of the keys were labeled, though some of the labels had curled up at the edges and one had fallen off entirely. Jason had left everything in better order than I expected. The rent receipts were stacked in a metal tray. The spare keys hung from hooks behind the desk, and the closing checklist was written on the back of an old utility bill. I read through it twice because I didn't want to miss anything simple and make the place look more neglected than it already did. I had inherited the lot after Jason died, which was not something I had ever expected to say about my life. I had expected to keep working at the warehouse, maybe pay down the credit cards, and eventually find a place with a yard that didn't belong to somebody else. Then the warehouse disappeared under me. Jason's heart gave out the following spring, and suddenly I owned 60 storage units outside Barstow. The plan was to run the place for a few months and sell it. The property had value, or enough value to make the idea worth trying, and I could use the money to deal with the debts left over from the warehouse job. I didn't need to like the lot. I just needed to keep the lights on, collect the rent, and not lose anything important before I found a buyer. By the time I finished the ordinary closing routine, the sun was down behind the low hills. The desert cold came on quickly after dark, slipping through the gaps around the office door and making the metal desk feel damp beneath my wrist. I was putting the last receipt into the drawer when I noticed a laminated card taped to the underside of the desk. It was old enough that the corners had gone cloudy, but the words were still easy to read. The card read, "Rules for Unit 31. I pulled it free and held it beneath the office light. There were 6 rules, typed in capital letters, with a black line between each one. Never rent Unit 31. Never open Unit 31. Tell anyone who asks for it that it is occupied. If its padlock is found open, close the unit before sundown. If knocking comes from the unit between 3 and 4 in the morning, turn off the office lights and ignore the intercom. Leave the rent paid through 2074. I read the last one twice, then laughed because there wasn't anybody there to hear me. 2074 was far enough away that it made the whole thing seem less like a business instruction and more like something Jason had written during one of his bad stretches. Never rent Unit 31, I said, looking down at the card. Never open Unit 31. The office gave me back a dull little echo. Jason had gotten superstitious before his heart failure. He had started locking doors that didn't need to be locked and keeping notes about things that didn't matter. I put the card on the desk and took the ring of keys with me. The lot looked different after dark. During the day it was only orange doors, concrete and gravel, with the highway moving beyond the fence. At night the security lights made each aisle seem longer than it was, and the spaces between the buildings turned black almost immediately. My boots made a dry crunch as I walked from door to door, checking the padlocks and comparing the numbers to the list. The first few units were ordinary. One had a broken plastic chair outside it, and another had a strip of blue carpet caught beneath the door. I checked the locks and kept moving. Unit 31 was near the far end of the aisle, between 2 units with their doors shut tight. The unit on the left had a couch visible through a gap near the bottom, the fabric dark with dirt. The one on the right held what looked like a mattress, 2 dining chairs, and the loose arm of another couch. The furniture had been abandoned long enough to lose any connection to the people who had owned it. Unit 31 had an old government orange rolling door, but the padlock was newer than everything around it. It was black and clean, without the pale dust that covered the other locks. A second lock had been welded onto the frame beneath it. I crouched to look more closely. The weld was thick and uneven, with gray metal spread around the edges like dried candle wax. Jason had either put it there himself or paid somebody who didn't care how it looked. I reached out and touched the rolling door. It was warm. I kept my hand against it for another second because I thought I might have touched a spot where the security light had been shining. The metal was warm all the way across the width of my palm, warmer than the office wall and warmer than the keys in my hand. I pulled back and looked at my fingers. There was a straight, damp line running from beneath the door. It crossed the concrete in a narrow track and continued toward the center of the aisle. The line was not wide enough to be a leak from a hose, and it didn't spread the way water usually spread when it came out of somewhere. It looked as if somebody had drawn it there with a wet finger. I stood up and looked at the units on either side. There were no pipes along that wall. The lot had no plumbing connections behind Unit 31, and Jason's notes showed no repair work in that section. The only water line I knew about ran along the office side of the property. I touched the door again, this time with the back of my fingers. It was still warm. "Look," I said to the empty aisle, though I wasn't sure what I was arguing with. "There has to be a leak somewhere." Nothing moved behind the door. The two locks stayed where they were, shining beneath the security light. I went back to the office without opening the unit. Inside, I found Jason's maintenance notebook beneath the receipt tray. The cover was soft from use, and several pages had curled at the corners. Most of the entries were ordinary things about replacing bulbs, spraying weeds, and fixing hinges that had started to drag. I opened to a clean page and wrote down the date, the unit number, and the warm metal. Then I described the damp line beneath the door and noted that there were no pipes or plumbing connections behind the unit. In the morning, I decided, I would go through the business records and see if Jason had written anything about a hidden leak or an old repair. I set the notebook beside the keys, left the card on the desk, and left for the night. The night passed without anything else happening, at least nothing I could see or hear. I went home, slept badly, and came back to the lot after the sun was up, carrying the same uneasy feeling I'd had when I left the office. The damp line beneath Unit 31 had been in my mind most of the night. I kept telling myself it was a plumbing problem, even though I knew there weren't any pipes behind that wall. I had also kept thinking about the card taped beneath the desk, especially where it said the rent had to stay paid through 2074. In the morning light, the office looked smaller than it had the night before. The windows showed the gravel aisle and the orange doors beyond it, all of them ordinary again. I unlocked the front door, turned on the fluorescent lights, and sat behind the desk with Jason's maintenance notebook in front of me. The business records were kept in a row of cardboard folders beneath the desk. I pulled them out one at a time and found the ledger near the bottom, underneath receipts and old tax papers. It was a thick book with a dark green cover, and the pages had gone soft around the edges from years of being handled. Every unit had its own line. There were 59 of them, each with a renter's name, a payment history, and a few notes about late fees or broken locks. Unit 30 was listed, then Unit 32. The space between them was no different from any other blank space in the ledger. Unit 31 wasn't there. I checked the pages again, this time running my finger down the left side where the numbers had been written. The ledger went from 30 to 32 without stopping. I had expected to find something, though I wasn't sure what. A note about a leak would have been enough. Even a line saying Jason didn't rent it would have made more sense than leaving the number out entirely. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the desk. The top drawer held pens, rubber bands, a flashlight, and a few unpaid invoices. The bottom drawer had a bent metal latch that stuck when I pulled on it. I worked it loose and found several envelopes, a roll of electrical tape, and a small brass key taped beneath the drawer. The key fit the lock on the narrow compartment at the back of the desk. I had seen it before without paying attention to it. Jason kept the desk shut most of the time, and I had assumed the locked section held money or something equally boring. Instead, there was one yellow folder inside, sealed across the flap with a thick piece of yellow wax. The seal had a crooked mark pressed into it. It might have been a letter, though the wax was too rough to tell which one. I carried the folder to the center of the desk and broke the seal with the edge of my house key. The wax snapped in two and fell onto the papers beneath it. The first sheet was a list of people who had asked about Unit 31. Their names were written in Jason's narrow handwriting, with a date beside each one. Every name had been crossed out. Most of the entries had the word gone written beside them. 2 said moved. 1 said refused. I read the page from top to bottom, then turned it over to see if there was anything on the back. There wasn't. I looked at the crossed-out names again, trying to decide whether gone meant they had left the area or something worse. Jason had not written enough to make the distinction. He had never been good at explaining things when he was alive. A Polaroid was tucked behind the list. The white border had yellowed, and the picture itself had faded until the sky looked almost gray. Jason stood beside another man in front of Unit 31, both of them wearing work clothes and heavy gloves. Jason looked much younger, though I recognized him immediately. His hair was dark, and his face hadn't yet narrowed from age. The other man was older than Jason, maybe by 10 or 15 years, with a long face and a pair of safety glasses pushed up on his forehead. They were welding the second lock onto the door. A bright spark hung in the middle of the picture, frozen between the man's gloved hands and the metal frame. Jason was looking toward the camera, but the other man had his head turned toward the lock. Neither of them looked happy to be there. I turned the Polaroid over. The writing on the back was in Jason's hand, but the warning had been signed with a single letter. Keep Unit 31 wet. Keep its rent paid. Keep it shut. H. I read it twice. Then I put the photograph down beside the list and picked up my phone. Rosa answered on the second ring.
Have you been working after dark?
She didn't say hello first. I was sitting beneath the fluorescent light with the Polaroid in front of me, and for a moment I didn't answer because I could hear how quickly she had asked it. Yes.
Jasper, did you open Unit 31?
No.
Did you go out there?
I checked the locks. There was a pause on the line.
How long were you outside?
I don't know, a few minutes.
Jasper.
I found something in Jason's records.
You need to leave the lot.
Look, I'm not opening the door. I just found a folder in the desk and there's a list of people who asked about Unit 31. Rosa didn't answer. The names are crossed out, I said. Most of them say gone. 2 say moved. 1 says refused.
Don't read it.
It's already read.
Then put it back.
Who was H? Her voice changed when I asked that. It got quieter, though not calmer.
Jason made me promise never to take a night shift.
I looked down at the picture again. The older man was standing close to the second lock, leaning toward it as if he expected it to move. What does that have to do with the list?
Jasper, did you work after dark?
I just told you I did.
Then you already know that isn't safe.
I know there's moisture coming from under the door. The silence lasted longer this time.
How much?
It was a narrow line last night. This morning it's wider.
Don't call me again about Unit 31.
Rosa, who is H?
Don't call me again.
She ended the call before I could ask anything else. I kept the phone against my ear for another second, listening to the empty line. Then I lowered it and set it beside the Polaroid. I put the list and the photograph back into the folder. The broken wax seal stayed on the desk like a piece of yellow crayon. I didn't try to close the folder again. I left the folder open so I could keep the warning in view. The safe was mounted beneath the desk. Behind a panel, Jason had painted the same dull gray as the wall. I had found it on the first day, though I hadn't used it for anything except the cash box. I set the folder inside and moved the cash to the side. Before closing the safe, I picked up the notebook and wrote down the words from the back of the Polaroid exactly as they appeared. Keep Unit 31 wet. Keep its rent paid. Keep it shut. I added the letter beneath them, then carried the notebook outside. The damp line had widened while I was on the phone. It ran from beneath the rolling door in a dark, narrow streak, reaching farther into the aisle than it had the night before. The concrete around it had turned darker too, as if the moisture was soaking into the surface instead of drying in the morning air. I crouched and measured it against the width of my thumb. Then I wrote that down as well, including the date and the time, because Jason had taught me that records mattered even when I didn't understand what they were recording. When I came back inside, I closed the notebook and returned it to the desk. I shut the safe and turned the key until the lock caught. The next 3 days passed in the ordinary way, which mostly meant collecting rent, answering questions about late fees, and checking the locks whenever I walked past the units. I kept that unit shut. I didn't go back out there at night, and I stopped touching the door during the day, even though I still noticed the stain on the concrete whenever I had to walk down that aisle. The wet streak had dried by the second morning. By the third, there was only a darker mark on the concrete beneath the door, like an old spill that hadn't been cleaned properly. I told myself that was a good sign. I also kept Jason's rules beside the cash box, where I could see them whenever I opened the drawer. I had started to think that maybe Rosa was right about the lot being unsafe after dark, though I still didn't have a useful explanation for the water or the list of names in Jason's folder. The rules were easier to understand than the reasons behind them. It was the 5th morning since I had taken over the place. The sun was already bright on the gravel outside, but the office still felt cool and dim compared to the parking area. I was behind the counter sorting receipts when a man stopped at the open window. He was pale, and it made his gray suit look darker than it was. His hair was neatly parted, his shirt was white, and his shoes were polished well enough that I could see the office light reflected in them. He carried a small envelope in one hand. He set it on the counter and looked past me toward the rows of orange doors. "Unit 31, he said. I had been expecting somebody to ask eventually. Jason had written down enough names to make that clear, though I had imagined a renter with a truck or a real estate agent looking for old paperwork. I hadn't expected the man in the suit. "Unit 31 is occupied." He looked back at me. His eyes were gray and still, and moisture showed on his face, though the morning was not hot enough to explain it. "It's paid through 2074. I know what the card says. I hadn't meant to say that. The man glanced at the desk and I saw his eyes move toward the drawer where I kept the rules. I closed the drawer with my hip. "I'm here early to collect the key. I'm the new keeper," he said. The last 2 words held my attention. I had never heard anybody describe a storage unit that way. They didn't become keepers. "The unit is occupied," I said. "Yes." He said it so calmly that I thought maybe I had misunderstood him. He opened the envelope and took out a stack of bills, folded once in the middle. The money was exact. I didn't count it because I could see that it was the same amount listed on the card, and because I didn't want to touch anything he had brought. "I'm not giving you the key." He rested his hands on the counter. His fingers were long and very clean. "That won't be necessary. Look, I don't know who you are, but Unit 31 isn't available. My name is Miguel Washington." He said it like he was completing a form. I looked at the bills again, then at him. "Are you the renter?" "I'm the keeper." "That's not the same thing." "That's the current arrangement." I didn't have an answer for that. The water cooler stood behind me beside the filing cabinet, a clear plastic bottle nearly full from the refill I had put on it the day before. I heard a low, bubbling sound behind my shoulder. At first I thought the cooler was settling. The office had been quiet, and the sound was small enough that I might have ignored it if Miguel hadn't been watching me. The bottle trembled on top of the cooler. I turned around. A stream of water had begun running down the side of the bottle, collecting around the base and spilling over the lip of the tray. The cooler wasn't plugged in. It had no pump, no light, and no reason to make any sound at all. I stepped away from it. "There's a leak," I said. Miguel looked at the water as it spread across the floor. "You should check the connection." "I know how to check a water cooler." "Then check it." The water reached the leg of the counter and began moving around it in a thin sheet. It was heading toward Miguel's shoes. He didn't move. The polished leather stayed perfectly still while the water crossed the floor between us. I looked behind the cooler. The wall was dry. There was no pipe there, and no loose hose running beneath the cabinet. The bottle continued bubbling as if somebody were blowing air into it from below. "You're going to have to leave," I said. Miguel picked up the envelope and folded it around the money. "I'll come back at 3 a.m. I didn't answer him. He waited a moment longer, though he didn't seem to be waiting for permission. Then he turned and walked toward the office door. The The water moved with him, spreading across the floor in a narrow path that seemed to follow the space in front of his shoes. He went through the door and crossed the gravel toward the gate. I came out after him because I wanted to see where he had parked, or maybe because I didn't want him walking around the lot by himself. The parking area was empty, except for my truck. Miguel continued toward the chain-link gate without looking back. His shoes made no sound on the gravel. When he passed through the gate, I saw that the ground behind him was wet. It began at the office door and continued across the lot in a dark trail, passing beneath the gate and ending at the road. The gravel was damp on both sides of the path, and the concrete near the office had gone nearly black. There were no footprints. I stood at the gate and looked down. The trail resembled the narrow mark beneath the unit, though it was longer now and much wetter. It stopped at the edge of the road without spreading into the dust beyond it. Miguel was already walking away along the shoulder. He didn't turn around. I could see the back of his gray jacket until the road dipped and took him out of sight. I went back into the office and removed the bottle from the cooler. It was heavier than I expected, and water sloshed inside it when I carried it outside and set it beside the wall. The puddle beneath the cooler stopped growing as soon as the bottle was gone. I checked the floor, the wall, and the base of the filing cabinet for a pipe or a split line. There wasn't one. The only water connection was on the other side of the office, and the floor beneath it was completely dry. I wiped up what I could with an old towel, then went back to the counter and took out the ring of keys. Jason's card was still in the drawer. I read the rules again, without laughing at the date. I had thought Jason was being superstitious. I had thought Rosa was afraid of something she couldn't explain. Now Miguel had come to the office carrying the rent, claimed a unit that wasn't listed, and promised to return at 3 a.m. I put the key ring in the drawer and shut it. Then I walked out to the gate, pulled it closed, and locked it. I kept my hand on the lock for a few seconds after it caught, even though there was no reason to think the gate would come open by itself. The road beyond it was empty, and Miguel was already gone, but I still looked along the fence in both directions before walking back toward the office. The water trail had started drying near the gate. It left the gravel darker than the surrounding ground, with a narrow line of wet stones running from the door to the road. I followed it with my eyes instead of stepping over it. The trail seemed to get wider the closer it came to the building. Inside the office, I pulled the filing cabinet away from the wall. It was the short gray cabinet beneath the window, the one that held old rental forms and copies of Jason's tax papers. I had to empty the top drawer before I could move it, and the papers slid onto the floor in a loose pile. The cabinet scraped across the concrete as I pushed it toward the door. It was heavier than it looked, though the drawers were mostly empty now. I turned it sideways and wedged it against the door handle, then pulled on the door to see if it would hold. If somebody really wanted to get inside, they could probably shove the cabinet out of the way. I put the yellow folder on the desk beside me. The broken wax seal was still lying where I had left it, and the list of names showed through the open flap. I left the folder where I could reach it, but didn't read the names again. Jason's card stayed beside the cash box. I picked it up and read through the rules one at a time. Never rent Unit 31. Never open Unit 31. If anyone asked for it, I was to say it was occupied. If its padlock was open, I was to close the unit before sundown. Knocking from the unit between 3 and 4 in the morning meant turning off the office lights and ignoring the intercom. The rent was to stay paid through 2074. They still sounded ridiculous when I read them in the daylight, with a filing cabinet pushed against my door and water running somewhere outside. The difference was that I no longer believed they were meant to protect the business. They were instructions. I set the card down and looked through the window toward Unit 31. I could see the black padlock from the office, though the second lock was partly hidden by the angle of the building. The orange door was closed. Nothing appeared to be moving behind it. The wet streak had spread across the aisle since I last checked. It ran in a thin curve across the concrete and ended at the drain grate near the office wall. Water had collected between the bars, darkening the metal around them. There was no puddle anywhere else. I went outside and walked to the unit, keeping to the dry side of the aisle. The padlock was still closed, and the welded lock had not shifted. I crouched beside them without touching either one. The concrete beneath the door was wet all the way across now. It looked less like a leak than a line being drawn from inside the unit. I returned to the office and filled the sink. The faucet coughed when I turned it on. Brown water came out first, carrying small grains of dirt that settled around the drain. After a few seconds it cleared, and I let the sink fill until the water reached halfway up the basin. The water turned brown again without warning. I shut off the faucet and watched the color move through the sink. It faded from brown to gray, then cleared a little at a time. The pipes in the wall made a ticking sound as the water stopped running. There wasn't supposed to be much dirt in the line. The office had old plumbing, but the water had always come out clear before. I ran it again, and the same thing happened. Brown, clear, brown, then clear enough that I could see the silver drain beneath it. I left the sink full. The wall behind it felt warm when I put my palm against the cinder block. It wasn't hot, but it was warmer than the wall beside the filing cabinet and warmer than the concrete floor. I moved my hand along the blocks toward the partition facing Unit 31, and the warmth continued around the corner. I checked the other walls. The cinder block near the front window was cool. The wall behind the desk was cool. Only the wall around the sink and the partition toward the unit held any heat. Moisture had gathered beneath the desk. It showed as a dark line along the bottom edge, spreading over the concrete in small, uneven patches. The air inside the office was dry enough to make my throat scratch, and dust still clung to the corners of the room. There was no reason for water to be collecting under the desk. I moved the chair and got down on one knee. The underside of the desk was damp. I touched it with 2 fingers, then looked at them. The water was clear. I wiped my hand on my jeans and stood up. I checked the walls again. They stayed warm beneath my palm. The first night I had been willing to call it a leak because that was the kind of problem I knew how to deal with. A leak had a source, even if the source was hidden. You found the pipe, shut off the water, and repaired whatever had failed. This was different. The water was coming from the unit, or from the ground beneath it, and it was moving toward the office. The sink had started running dirty water after Miguel arrived. The wall was warm, the desk was wet, and the trail outside had followed him through the gate without leaving footprints. I stood in the middle of the office and looked at Jason's card. The thing in Unit 31 was weakened by dryness. The dry desert air pulled the water from beneath the door, and the locked door kept whatever was inside from coming through. The rent mattered too, though I didn't understand why. The words sounded stupid in my head, but not as stupid as they had that morning. I had been planning to sell the lot. I had spent the first few days thinking about buyers, repairs, and how much money I could get if I cleaned up the property and kept the books in order. I had also been trying to prove that Jason had been wrong about the unit, because proving him wrong would have made the rest of my life easier. I didn't need to prove him wrong anymore. I needed to keep the door locked, keep the rent paid, and keep water around Unit 31 until I understood what happened at 3 in the morning. I picked up my phone and called Rosa. It rang several times before the call went to the message. I called again because she had ended the last conversation before I could tell her about Miguel. The phone rang until it stopped on its own. I tried a 3rd time. Rosa didn't answer. I opened the messages and typed her name. My first attempt was too long, and I erased part of it before sending anything. I couldn't write about the water or the walls. I had no way to explain them without sounding like Jason. I sent, Miguel Washington had come for Unit 31 and promised to be back at 3 a.m. I watched the message sit on the screen without a reply. The office was quiet except for the faint movement of water in the sink, even though the faucet was shut off. I set the phone beside the folder and dragged the chair around until it faced the intercom. The office lights stayed on. The rest of the day passed without Rosa answering my message. I left the room lit, kept the sink full, and worked with the yellow folder beside me as I went through the receipts and late notices. I didn't get much done. Every time the building made a noise, I looked toward the window across from the locked unit. By evening, the office had taken on the stale, closed-in feeling it got after the sun went down. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, and the windows showed only my own reflection over the dark rows of units. I had shoved the cabinet against the door earlier, but I checked it twice anyway. The folder stayed open on the desk. I didn't read the crossed-out names again, but I could see them whenever I looked down. They had begun to feel less like records and more like people who had stood where I was standing, trying to decide whether a warning was meant for them. At 2:40 in the morning, water moved inside the walls. I was in my chair with my phone in my hand when I heard it. It sounded like a pipe filling somewhere beyond the cinder block, followed by a soft rush that traveled from the sink toward the adjoining wall. The faucet was still closed. The sink water had gone cold and clear. I stood up and put my palm against the wall. It was warm again. The sound continued beneath my hand, slow and heavy, as if water was being pushed through a space too narrow to hold it. I checked the sink, then the connection beneath it, though I already knew there wasn't anything there that could explain the noise. Nothing was leaking. I went back to the desk and looked at the card near the cash box. The rule about the knocking was written in Jason's handwriting, with the same narrow letters he had used for the other instructions. The instruction was simple. Between 3 and 4, if someone knocked from that unit, I was to shut off the lights and ignore the intercom. I had read that line enough times to know it without looking. That didn't make it easier to follow. At 2:55, the knocking began. It came from inside the locked unit, slow enough that I heard the space between each sound. 3 knocks, then a pause. 3 more. The metal door gave a small shudder in its frame, though the 2 locks stayed still. I reached for the light switch and stopped with my fingers just above it. The desk was cluttered with receipts. The folder was open beside the phone, and old tax forms sat on top of the cabinet blocking the door. Another knock came from the unit. I turned off the lights. The room went black except for the weak glow from my phone. I pushed it tighter against the door until its metal feet scraped across the concrete. It didn't move very far, but the sound of it seemed too loud in the dark. I left the intercom alone. The knocking continued outside. Then the intercom clicked on. I flinched and nearly dropped my phone. A small green light appeared beneath the speaker, shining through the dark beside the door.
Jasper, it's me. The funeral was a mistake. Let me out. It's cold in here.
Jason's voice came through the speaker. It sounded exactly like him. Low, dry, and a little breathless, the way he had sounded when he had been working outside in the heat. For a second I could see him standing at the office door in his stained work shirt, one hand raised toward the glass, waiting for me to unlock it. The knocking stopped. I moved toward the intercom. Jason had been dead for 3 days. I knew that. I had stood at the funeral home and watched people shake their heads over how quickly everything had happened. I had gone through his house after the funeral, taken the keys, and read the note he left me about the lot. Still, hearing his voice made the facts feel less certain. "Jason?" The speaker gave a faint crackle.
Jasper, let me out.
I reached toward the release button. The button was small and square, set beneath the speaker where Jason had always told me not to press it during the night hours. My hand shook as I held it over the plastic. Then water appeared beneath the speaker. It gathered along the bottom edge in a clear bead, swelled, and dropped onto the wall. Another bead formed behind it. The water ran down over the painted cinder block, passing through the green light and making it flicker. I stopped moving. The voice came through again, quieter this time.
Jasper, it's cold in here.
Water continued to leak from the speaker. It ran in thin lines down the wall and collected along the baseboard, darkening the concrete there. The office smelled like wet dust. The yellow folder on the desk caught my eye. The crossed-out names were still visible through the open flap. Gone, moved, refused. I didn't know what had happened to the people on the list. "I'm not opening that door," I said. The speaker clicked. The knocking started once more, harder than before. The metal door next door shook with each strike, and something hit the inside of the office wall at the same time. Dust fell from the seam above the sink. I picked up the folder and turned it over. The back flap was still sealed with yellow wax. I had left it that way because the first page in the photograph had already made the rest of the folder feel dangerous. Now, the wax looked less important than the water running beneath the intercom. I took my house key from my pocket and pushed it under the edge of the seal. The wax resisted, then cracked. I worked the key along the flap until the paper tore open, pulling loose fibers from the yellow folder. The knocking kept going while I opened it, steady and loud enough that I could feel it in my chest. There was one final page inside. The paper was folded once, and Jason's handwriting covered the front. I recognized the narrow letters immediately, the same writing that had told me to keep the unit wet, keep its rent paid, and keep it shut. I unfolded the page. I kept my eyes on the intercom. The voice had stopped. The knocking had not. I lifted my hand toward the release button again and held it just short of the plastic while water ran from the speaker down the wall. I pulled the page closer with my free hand and read the first line while the water kept running down from the intercom. Jason had written that the thing in Unit 31 learned the voices of drowned people. It learned them from the water, he said, and used them when it wanted somebody to open a door. I read that twice because the words didn't make sense together. The voice on the speaker had sounded like Jason, but I already knew that. I had heard him say my name, heard the same roughness in his throat and the same short way he put a sentence together. What I hadn't known was that the voice had come from somewhere else. The next paragraph said the thing moved through pipes. I looked toward the sink. The water in it was still, though the surface trembled whenever the knocking came from the unit. The pipes beneath the basin ticked inside the wall. The sound was coming from the plumbing, but that didn't mean the water belonged there. Jason had written that this unit was first used to contain the thing after it drowned a man there in 1974. He hadn't written the man's name, and he hadn't explained how anybody had figured out what happened. The paragraph just stopped there, leaving a dark smear of ink at the bottom of the page where his pen had pressed too hard. The knocking continued outside. I read the next section. The gray suit was the form the thing wore when it was nearly loose. It could come to the office, collect the rent, and ask for the key, but it couldn't take the unit while the locks stayed closed. The rent was part of the containment. It had to stay paid through 2074. I had seen Miguel standing in the office with wet skin and polished shoes, holding the exact amount in an envelope. He had called himself the keeper. I had thought that was some kind of mistake, or a word he used because he wanted me to understand that he wasn't a renter. He hadn't come for the unit. He had come because the arrangement was failing. The page said that if the lock was found open, the thing was already outside. The welded lock snapped before I finished the sentence. The sound was small compared to the knocking, just a sharp crack from the aisle, but it went through me so quickly that my hand jerked away from the page. The intercom light flickered. Something scraped against the metal door. I turned toward the window. The lock on the hasp hung loose, its broken end swinging once before coming to rest. The door had lifted about 6 inches. Water poured beneath it and spread over the concrete in a flat, shining sheet. I stood there with Jason's page in my hand. The first lock was still attached. The black padlock hung below the broken welded lock, but the door had begun to rise around it. The metal groaned as if something inside was pushing upward. The page shifted between my fingers. The last line was still in front of me. If the lock is open, the thing is outside. I dropped the page on the desk and closed my hand around the ring of keys. The filing cabinet still blocked my way out, so I pulled it away from the handle before I could get through. The cabinet legs scraped over the concrete, knocking papers to the floor. The water had reached the desk. It ran around my boots when I stepped toward the door. I glanced at the floor, expecting to see it coming from the sink or beneath the wall, but the floor around the cabinet was dry. The water was simply there. spreading across the office in every direction at once. I pulled the door open and ran into the aisle. The night air felt dry against my face. The gravel outside the office was dark with water, and the wet line beneath the unit had widened across the concrete until it covered most of the space in front of the door. Water moved around my shoes as I crossed it, cold enough that my feet went numb through the boots. I kept my hand closed around the keys. The metal door was halfway open now. It had risen another few inches, and water pushed out from beneath it in a steady rush. There was no puddle inside the unit that I could see. The ground around the building was dry. The water had no pipe, no hose, and no source that I could find, but it continued coming through the gap. I ran faster. The door shuddered above me. The black padlock struck the metal once, then again, making a hard tapping sound as the door rose around it. The office light reached only the first strip of concrete inside, leaving the rest dark. Jason's page had said the thing was already outside. I had been thinking about that as a warning, something that would happen if the lock came open. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a description of where I was standing. The water rose over the tops of my boots. I almost lost my footing, caught myself, and kept going. The keys cut into my palm. I had the thought that I needed the first lock, that I needed to close the door before it rose any farther, and then I saw movement beneath it. A hand came through the gap. It was pale and wet, with the fingers spread against the concrete. The skin looked gray beneath the water, and the nails were dark along their edges. It moved forward slowly, fingers spread against the concrete. I stopped. The hand closed around my ankle. Its grip was colder than the water and strong enough to lift my heel off the ground. I grabbed the edge of the door with one hand and pulled back, but the metal was slick and kept sliding under my fingers. The hand tightened. I kicked at the door. My boot struck the metal with a hollow bang, and the sound went through my leg. I kicked again, harder, twisting my ankle inside the grip. Let go. The fingers didn't move. I kicked a third time and felt something shift under the door. The hand loosened for half a second and I tore my leg backward. The wet fingers dragged over my boot, caught at the heel and slipped free with a sound like a wet cloth pulled from a drain. I stumbled away from the unit. The keys flew out of my hand. I reached for them, missed, and went down hard on one knee. Water splashed up over my jeans. The door kept rising behind me, metal rattling in its tracks, and the opening widened enough that something inside struck the bottom edge. I pushed myself up and ran for the office. My ankle buckled before I reached the door. I caught the frame with both hands, but the wet gravel slid under my boots. Light spilled across the threshold, and I fell into it, hitting the concrete with my shoulder while the water moved around my legs. The water kept moving around my legs while I tried to get my hands beneath me. It was coming from the unit and spreading over the office threshold, even though the gravel outside the door was dry a few feet away. I pushed against the frame and dragged myself back into the aisle. My shoulder hurt from the fall, and my ankle felt weak where the hand had grabbed it. I tried to stand anyway. The water rose with me, climbing from my boots to my knees and then higher, soaking through my jeans as if I had stepped into a deep pool. There was no pool. The desert air stayed dry against my face. I could feel the dust in it, hot and rough in my throat, while water pushed against my chest. I opened my mouth to breathe and swallowed a mouthful instead. It went down wrong, and I coughed hard enough to bend over. Water came out of my lungs and nose. I stayed bent over, gripping the office door with one hand, while the flood moved around me on dry gravel. I had never understood how people could drown in shallow water. I understood it then. Something shifted in the dark beneath the rolling door. The metal rattled again, and the black padlock struck the side of the frame. I could hear the water pushing through the opening, though the unit itself stayed mostly black beyond the strip of office light. Then my own voice came from inside. "Help me." I looked toward the door. The voice had the same rough sound mine had after coughing, and it came from low in the dark, close to the ground. I had heard myself say those words. I had heard the fear in them. The voice repeated my breathing next. It took the breath I was trying to pull in and sent it back from the unit, wet and uneven. When I stopped to listen, it stopped too. When I breathed again, it breathed after me. I tried to move toward the office, but my legs slid out from beneath me. My hips struck the gravel and water closed over my stomach. I coughed again. The air above me was still clear, but my lungs kept tightening as though I had been underwater for longer than I had. It made the breaths slower, with long gaps between them. Then it made them quick and shallow. Then it copied the sound of me trying not to panic, which was close enough to my own breathing that I couldn't tell which one I was hearing. I had to shut the unit. I had to keep it dry. Jason's instructions had sounded stupid when they were written on the card, and they had sounded less stupid when water came through the intercom. Keep it shut. Keep the rent paid. Keep water around the unit. But keep the thing itself dry. I rolled onto my side and crawled away from the office. The water followed me across the gravel, spreading around my elbows and chest. I tried to breathe through my nose, but it made no difference. Every few seconds I had to lift my face and cough water onto the stones. Jason's tool corner was beside the office, beneath the narrow metal awning where he had kept the welding equipment and lengths of scrap steel. I had seen the rig there before, though I had never used it. Jason had left most things ready to work, including the cable plugged into the outlet along the back wall. I reached the corner and found the welding rig on its small rolling cart. The cable ran from the back of it to the office wall, disappearing beneath the door. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The cart moved an inch, then stopped against a coil of hose. I pulled again, harder, and the hose came loose from beneath one wheel. The cart rolled toward me, bumping over the gravel while the water climbed over my ribs. I coughed until my vision blurred, then kept pulling it into the aisle. The presence spoke in my voice again. "Jasper, help me." I stopped with both hands on the cart. It had said my name the way I said it when I was trying to get somebody's attention. There was no panic in it now. It sounded patient. I kept pulling. The water reached my neck by the time I got the rig to the unit. I could breathe only by lifting my head back, and even then each breath came with a cough. The cart wheels caught in the gravel, so I dragged it the rest of the way and left one knee scraping along the concrete. The rolling door had risen several inches above the ground. Water poured through the gap, pushing against my chest and carrying bits of gravel around my hands. I put my shoulder under the lower edge and pushed upward first, trying to take some of the weight before forcing it down. The door shook above me. I pulled it toward the concrete. Something on the other side pushed back, and the metal stopped with a gap of several inches still beneath it. My shoulder pressed into the bottom rail. The steel was cold and slick, and the water coming through it struck my face with enough force to make me close my eyes. I could not hold it there for long. I reached back with one hand and found the welder's controls. Jason had labeled the main switch with a strip of white tape, the same way he had labeled the keys in the office. I turned it on and picked up the torch. The machine started with a low electrical hum. I had to keep my shoulder against the door while I fitted the mask over my face, and the first movement made the opening widen another inch. Water blasted through and filled my mouth. I held the door down with my shoulder and started the weld. Bright light flashed beneath the mask. The metal spat against the concrete, hot sparks jumping across my sleeve and dying in the water. I moved the torch along the door's lower seam in short sections, stopping whenever the pressure from inside shoved it upward. Each time it rose, I leaned harder into it. The presence screamed in my voice beside my ear. It sounded like me shouting from the office, then like me shouting from the road, though I knew I was the only person standing in the aisle. The sound came through the water and the metal and the mask, changing distance without getting quieter. I kept welding. The first section held. I moved to the next one, dragging the torch through the gap while water struck my face and ran beneath the mask. My hand shook so badly that the bead went crooked. I started over and filled the break. "Rosa, open the door." The voice came from just behind my head. I knew Rosa would have told me to leave. She would have asked why I was still there, then told me that whatever was happening inside 31 wasn't safe. The thing knew that too, or it knew enough to use her name. "Rosa, open the door." I didn't answer. I moved the torch along the base until the weld crossed the full width of the door. The water still pushed through the sides, but the gap beneath it had narrowed. The pressure from inside kept striking the metal in heavy blows, and each one traveled through my shoulder into my chest. I shifted to the left side of the frame. The door tried to rise as soon as I moved away from it, so I braced my back against the metal and pressed my shoulder into the corner. The torch hissed when it touched the frame. Hot metal ran downward in a bright line and disappeared into the water. The voice called for Rosa again, softer now. I kept welding and said nothing. When the left side held, I crossed to the right. My ankle buckled as I stepped through the water, but I caught the cart before I fell. The welder tipped toward me, and I pulled it upright with one hand while keeping the torch away from my leg. The right side took longer. The frame had warped around the broken lock, leaving a narrow black line where the door met the metal. I filled it in section by section, watching the sparks scatter across the wet concrete. The door pushed back until my shoulder went numb. I repeated the instruction aloud because I was afraid I would lose it. Keep it shut. Keep it dry. It stretched them out, making my voice sound tired and wet. I finished the right side and returned to the bottom. Water still streamed under the door, though it no longer spread as quickly across the aisle. I lowered the torch to the last open section and welded over it until the metal joined the frame from one side to the other. The final gap closed beneath the bright line of heat. The door settled against the concrete, and the water lost its force. It continued running for a moment, thin and dark along the base of the unit, then stopped advancing across the aisle. The water ran for a few seconds, thin and dark along the base of the unit, before disappearing into the drain grate beside the aisle. I stayed where I was with the torch lowered in my hand, waiting for the pressure to come back. It didn't. The metal door was still down against the concrete. The welds were crooked and blackened, with small beads of cooled metal scattered along its lower edge. Water circled them and moved toward the grate in narrow streams. The gravel beyond the aisle was already beginning to show through again. I took off the mask and set it on the cart. My face was wet, though I couldn't tell how much of it was water from the unit and how much was sweat. My throat burned every time I breathed, and my lungs still felt tight from swallowing the flood. The sky had started to lighten above the fence. It wasn't sunrise yet, but the darkness had thinned enough for me to see the rows of storage units. The water drained away while I watched, leaving the concrete dark and the gravel wet in patches. I tried to stand straight and nearly fell. My ankle gave out beneath me, and I caught the edge of the welding cart with both hands. The motion pulled at my shoulder and sent a sharp pain down my arm. I waited until the pain eased, then looked back at the sealed unit. The new weld was holding. I had wanted that to feel like a victory. Instead, I felt too tired to decide what it meant. Jason's page was still inside the office, along with the keys and the folder. The thing was sealed in again, if the door and the weld were enough to seal it. I didn't know whether they were. A few minutes later, the concrete had stopped shining. The gravel around the unit dried in uneven circles as if the ground had only been damp from an ordinary leak. I pushed the cart back beneath the awning and unplugged it from the wall. My fingers shook while I wound the cable around the handle. I left the torch on top of the machine and started toward the office, keeping one hand on the wall whenever my legs felt unsteady. The office door was open. Water covered the floor inside, but it had begun to thin around the desk and filing cabinet. The folder lay where I had dropped it, its last page spread beside the phone. The intercom light was off, and no water came from the speaker anymore. I stepped over the threshold and sat down in the chair. For a while, I just breathed. My chest hurt, and every breath brought the taste of dirty water back into my mouth. I wiped my face with my sleeve, then looked at the clock above the desk. The hands had moved past 6. I had been out in the aisle for hours, though it hadn't felt like that. The night had narrowed down to the door, the water, and the torch in my hand. Seeing the time made me feel worse instead of better. Morning meant the lot would eventually have customers, and I was sitting in a wet office with a broken lock and an injured ankle. I tried to get up again. This time I made it as far as the counter before my knees started to shake. That was where I saw Miguel. Miguel stood behind the counter with a pale envelope in one hand. His gray suit looked as clean as it had the night he first came in. His polished shoes were dry on the wet floor. I stopped with one hand against the counter. He looked at my shoulder, then at my ankle, and then passed me toward the sealed unit. His face stayed calm. I didn't know how long he had been there, and I didn't want to ask. "You came back," I said. "I said I'd come back," he said. His voice sounded smooth and hollow in the wet office. He set the envelope on the counter and opened it. Inside were bills arranged in a tight stack, all facing the same direction. I looked at the money, then at him. "What is that?" "The rent." "I already have the rent." "This is the current payment. Look, I can't—" "The rent's paid through 2124. You kept it. You're the keeper now." He said it with the flat tone of someone reading a ledger. There was no pride in it, and no concern for whether I agreed. I held onto the edge of the counter. "I didn't agree to that. You kept the unit shut. I welded the door closed. You kept it. I didn't do it for you." Miguel watched me without blinking. His skin looked pale and damp in the early light coming through the office windows, but his suit remained dry. "Then you understand the responsibility," he said. "I understand that whatever is in there tried to drown me. That's why the unit needs a keeper." I looked toward the aisle. The door to 31 was too far away to see clearly from the counter, but I could still picture the broken lock and the new weld running across the lower edge. My shoulder began to throb as the effort of standing caught up with me. "I don't want your money." Miguel left his hand beside the envelope. "The payment is not optional." I said I don't want it. "The rent is paid. Take it with you." He didn't answer. He pushed the envelope a few inches across the counter instead. It stopped near the cash box, beside the keys I had left there before the night went wrong. I stared at it. The exact amount of cash had seemed important when he brought it before. Now it looked like a stack of paper. I didn't touch it. Miguel turned away from the counter. I pushed myself after him, using the desk and the wall to stay upright. My ankle hurt with each step, and my lungs tightened when I tried to move too quickly. He walked out of the office without looking back. "Miguel." He kept going. I followed him past the welding cart and into the aisle. The sun was coming up behind the far fence, spreading a weak gray light over the lot. The unit stood sealed at the end of the row, with the water gone from the concrete and the weld still dark along its lower edge. Miguel continued toward the gate. I tried to call after him, but the breath caught in my throat and turned into a cough. I stopped beside the wall and bent forward until it passed. Water came up into my mouth. I spat it onto the gravel and kept walking. The ground behind Miguel was wet. A narrow trail ran from the office toward the gate, darker than the rest of the gravel and shining in the new light. His shoes left no marks in it. He walked at the same steady pace, neither hurrying nor slowing down for me. I made it as far as the parking area before my ankle folded again. I caught myself on the fence and looked at the gate. Miguel put one hand on the latch. He didn't turn around, and he didn't say goodbye. He opened the gate and walked through it. The wet ground behind him dried before I reached the parking area. I stayed against the fence until my ankle stopped shaking, then turned back in the direction of the office. By then, Miguel was gone, and the gate swung once behind him before settling against the post. The walk back was slow. My shoulder hurt whenever I used my arm, and my ankle had started swelling inside the boot. I kept one hand on the fence as I moved along it, stopping once to catch my breath and look toward the sealed unit. The door was still down. The weld held across the bottom, dark and uneven in the early light. From that distance, it looked almost ordinary. Inside the office, Miguel's envelope remained on the counter near the cash box. He hadn't taken the payment with him. I stood there looking at it for a few seconds, trying to understand why he would leave money behind after insisting that it wasn't optional. The only thing I knew about him was that he expected the lot to keep operating. The rent was paid. The unit was sealed. The next part, whatever he thought that was, belonged to me now. My phone sat beside the envelope with the screen dark. I picked it up and checked Rosa's missed call and the message she'd left several hours earlier. I hadn't noticed it during the night. The office had been too loud, and then I had been outside trying not to drown. I pressed the message and held the phone near my ear.
Adam, don't go out to the units tonight.
Rosa's voice sounded tired and farther away than it had when she spoke to me before. There was traffic behind her, or something like traffic, a low, steady noise that rose and fell beneath the words. I listened until the message reached the end. Then it started again. I almost lowered the phone. Rosa said the same warning a second time with the same pause before tonight and the same slight roughness in her voice. I waited for the message to stop, but the recording continued past the point where it had ended before.
Let me in. It's cold.
The words came from Rosa's voice, but they didn't belong to the message. They sounded closer than the first part, as though she'd been standing by the entrance instead of speaking into a phone somewhere outside. The last word dragged slightly, and the sound broke apart into a thin, electronic hiss. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the screen. The message was still playing. The timestamp hadn't changed. I listened again from the beginning.
Adam, don't go out to the units tonight.
The warning ended. There was a short gap, long enough for a real recording to finish. Then the second voice came through.
Let me in. It's cold.
I shut the message off. For a while, I stood with the phone in my hand and the envelope beside it. The first part was Rosa. I knew the way she spoke when she wanted me to take something seriously, how she put my name at the front of a warning and then asked a question instead of explaining herself. She had done that for years, even when we were younger and the problem was something simple. The second part sounded like her because the thing had already used her voice in the aisle. I had heard it call for Rosa while I was welding the door shut. It had made the words sound familiar enough to get my attention, then repeated them after I refused to answer. That had happened after the knocking started. This recording had been made earlier. I replayed the message once more, listening for anything beneath it that might tell me where the second voice came from. The traffic-like sound was still there, low and indistinct. It could have been a road. It could have been water moving through a pipe. I couldn't tell whether the presence had intercepted something Rosa sent me, or whether it had already taken her voice before the message was recorded. Rosa had warned me not to go out to the units, and the thing had added a request to be let inside. It hadn't been asking me to open that unit. I pressed call. The phone rang once, then again. I leaned against the counter and watched the envelope while I waited. The bills inside sat in a neat stack with their edges lined up. Miguel had handled them without leaving any dirt or water on the paper, even after walking through the wet office. Rosa didn't answer. I let it ring until the call ended, then stared at her name on the screen. There was no new message and no indication that she had seen the call. I tried again. This time I kept the phone to my ear and looked through the office window at the aisle. The sun had risen enough to brighten the gravel, though the sealed unit remained in shadow beneath the row of roofs. The bottom of the door was black from the weld, and a narrow, dark line still marked the concrete in front of it. The phone rang beside my ear. I thought about leaving the lot and driving to Rosa's house, but my truck was out by the parking area, and I could barely cross the office unless I held on to something. I also didn't know whether the message had been sent from her phone, or whether her phone had been somewhere near the presence when it made the recording. The call continued ringing. I had the urge to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I set it down beside the envelope and left my hand near it, as if I could make Rosa answer by staying close. I left my hand beside the phone for a while, waiting for Rosa to answer. It didn't. The screen went dark, and the office settled back into the same damp quiet it had held since Miguel walked out. About an hour passed before I picked up Jason's page again. The sun had climbed above the fence by then, and the light coming through the windows made the wet floor look like a mess I was supposed to clean instead of a flood. My ankle had stiffened while I sat there, and my shoulder ached whenever I reached across the desk, but I pulled the page toward me anyway. Jason's handwriting covered both sides. The letters were narrow and pressed hard into the paper, as if he had been rushing but still trying not to make a mistake. I had read the page during the night while the voice spoke over the intercom, though I hadn't been in any condition to take in all of it. At the time, I had been more concerned with keeping the door shut than understanding why the rules existed. Now I read it again. The thing in Unit 31 could speak in the voices of drowned people. It got those voices from the water and used them when it wanted somebody to open a door. The page gave no explanation of where it came from or what it wanted after the door opened. The rest of the page was shorter. Keep the unit shut. Keep the rent paid. Water had to stay around the unit, while the thing itself had to stay dry. Don't answer voices from inside. Don't leave the lot without another keeper present. The last instruction had been underlined twice. I kept looking at that one. Until then, I had thought the rules were something Jason had collected over time because he was afraid of what might happen if he stopped following them. I had treated the lot as property, the units as buildings, and the rent as the only thing that mattered. Even after the water came through the intercom, part of me had still been trying to separate the problem from the business. Jason hadn't left me the lot because he expected me to make money from it. He had left it to me because somebody had to keep the sealed unit shut. Selling the place would have meant handing the property to somebody who didn't know about the water, the voices, or how far ahead the rent had been paid. I had planned to sell the lot as soon as I could get it ready. That had been the reason I came there in the first place, aside from the debt and the fact that I didn't have many better options. I had looked at the empty units and the cracked office windows and thought about what the land might be worth if somebody cleaned it up. The payment receipt sat beside the page, folded once where Miguel had left it on the counter. I brought it over and opened it flat with my palm. The paper was dry and clean, with the amount written in the same careful way Miguel had arranged the bills in his envelope. The rent for Unit 31 was covered through 2124. I read the date twice. Miguel had said the same thing when he stood in front of the counter, and I had treated it like another impossible statement meant to make me angry. Seeing it on paper made it feel more official, which was worse. There was no hesitation in the number and no place where I could pretend I had misunderstood him. He hadn't been paying to rent a storage unit. He had been paying to keep the arrangement in place. I set the receipt beside Jason's page and looked at the desk. The rules card was still taped beneath it, where I had put it after finding it in the safe. The edge of the tape had come loose during the night, and one corner of the card had curled up from the damp. I could see Jason's 6 instructions through the narrow opening. I pulled the desk drawer open and reached beneath it. The tape came away with a soft, ripping sound. I peeled the card free and held it under the desk lamp. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and the ink had begun to fade in a few places, but I could still read every instruction. Keep it shut. Keep the rent paid. Water had to remain around the unit. Keep the thing dry. Don't answer voices from inside. Don't leave the lot without a keeper. I had followed the first rule by welding the door closed. I had followed the second one without wanting to. The rest had become clear only after the unit forced me to understand them. There was one problem with the last rule. The last line was a warning, but it didn't say what happened if the keeper was alone and had to leave. It didn't say whether another person could take over, or whether the lot could be left empty for an hour, or whether someone had to be sitting in the office every minute of every day. Miguel had left the money and called me the keeper. He hadn't asked whether I wanted the position, because he didn't seem to think that mattered. The payment was made. The unit was sealed. I took a pen from the cup near the phone and turned the card over. There wasn't enough room on the front beneath Jason's writing, so I found a blank strip at its lower edge and held it steady against the desk. My hand shook while I wrote. The keeper must never leave the lot unguarded. I read the sentence after I finished it. The words looked too large beneath Jason's smaller instructions, and the ink had bled slightly into the paper. He had spent years alone at the lot, watching the gates and checking the locks, and he had never told me that leaving was part of the danger. I folded the receipt and slid it into the folder. Then I put Jason's page on top of it and closed the folder, keeping the card in my other hand. I pressed a fresh strip of tape along the back, lined the card up where it had been, and held it there while the tape stuck. Then I smoothed the edges down with my thumb, sealing the rules card back inside the desk with my 7th rule written beneath Jason's instructions. I left my thumb against the edge of the card for a few seconds after the tape had stuck. The office was quiet, and the only sound outside was the thin movement of water near Unit 31. About 4 hours passed while I kept the lot operating. The sun moved across the windows and the wet floor dried in patches beneath the desk and filing cabinet. My ankle stiffened, then loosened enough that I could walk without holding onto every wall, though I still favored it whenever I went outside. I took a bucket to the drain grate and poured water down the aisle in front of the sealed door. It ran over the concrete and gathered around the bottom of the door before finding the grate. The new weld stayed dark beneath the water, uneven but solid. I crouched and ran my fingers over the edge without touching the metal itself. The door didn't move. I checked the lock next. The old lock was still bent from the night before, and the second lock Jason had added sat above it with the weld marks showing around the bracket. I tested both of them, pulling hard enough to make the metal shift in my hand. Nothing opened. I had to keep checking anyway. Knowing something was secure and feeling it hold were different things, especially after watching the door come up while water poured through the office. The second time I checked it, I pulled the handles twice and said the instructions out loud. Keep it shut, keep the rent paid, keep the water around it. My voice sounded thin in the aisle. I looked toward the office window, half expecting somebody to be standing behind me, but the room was empty except for the desk and the chair. The gravel around the unit had dried again. The flood had left dark stains near the doors and pushed loose dirt against the walls, but most of the lot looked as it had before. The desert had a way of taking things back quickly. Water disappeared, mud hardened, and a place that had nearly drowned me could look like it had only been watered with a garden hose. I didn't mistake that for safety. The units on both sides of 31 had been forced open when the water came through. Their doors stood crooked in the tracks, with cardboard boxes and plastic bins visible in the dark spaces behind them. I checked each lock and lowered what I could, though neither door closed properly anymore. The things inside were wet and scattered, and I moved a few of them away from the aisle so nobody would trip over them. I wrote down which doors had been damaged in the maintenance notebook. I also wrote that the gravel was dry, the drain was clear, and the weld on 31 was holding. The entry took longer than it should have because my hand kept tightening around the pen whenever I heard a noise from the far side of the property. Most of the noises were ordinary. A loose piece of metal tapped against a door in the wind. Something rolled across the roof of one of the units and dropped into the gravel. Once, a truck passed on the road beyond the fence and the sound faded before I could see it. The intercom stayed dark. I didn't touch it. Jason's warning about voices from inside stayed with me. The water had stopped coming from the speaker, but I left the towel beneath it and watched the fabric slowly dry. By late afternoon, I had stopped trying to prepare the lot for sale. The thought had been sitting in the office since I first came there, along with the folders and receipts and all the things I believed would tell me what the property was worth. I had planned to clean the place up, take some pictures, and see what I could get for the land. Instead, I opened the small storage closet behind the desk and pulled out the folding cot Jason had kept there. The canvas smelled like dust and old fabric. I carried it into the office and set it against the wall where I could see the aisle through the window. Then I brought in a blanket, a change of clothes, a bottle of water, and the small bag I had left in my truck. The office didn't have much room once the cot was open. Its legs scraped the floor whenever I moved it, and one corner sat lower than the others because the concrete wasn't level. I put the blanket over it anyway and laid my jacket at the head. I brought in the rest of what I needed in 2 trips. My boots stayed beside the door, and the maintenance notebook went on the desk. I left the keys in the drawer with the payment receipt, then took them back out because I wanted to know where they were. The receipt was still clean and dry. Miguel had left it next to the envelope. The rent on Unit 31 had been paid through 2124. The amount sat on the page in neat numbers, like a bill from any other tenant. I kept the envelope in the cash box. I didn't want the money, but leaving it outside where somebody could find it seemed worse. Miguel had said the payment wasn't optional, and I had finally understood that arguing with him didn't change what had already been done. He had left the rent, named me the keeper, and walked out through the gate as if he were finishing a routine visit. There wasn't anybody else there to take over. I sat at the desk with Jason's page in front of me. The maintenance notebook was open beneath it, and the 7th rule showed through the thin strip of card where I had written it beneath his instructions. The keeper could not leave the lot without someone watching it. I had written the sentence because Jason hadn't. Outside the window, water remained gathered around the sealed door. It made a dark shape against the concrete, and the fresh weld held beneath it. The drain grate took the excess slowly, without making much sound. I looked at the receipt, then at the notebook, and finally at the unit beyond the glass. I stayed in the office to keep watch over the sealed unit.